Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Here we are again, another Thursday night doing an episode. Tonight we're going to be talking about the challenges of raising African American boys, navigating the controlling image of the thug. We will get into that in 1 second. Before I do get into that, I just want to remind you that this show is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio, and there are other shows on the network that you should be checking out as well. And here's a couple of bumps, including the one for me.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Okay, so there it is. And there's also a show called The Queen's Council. Make sure to also check out The Queen's Council on KWAZ Radio. Before we get into tonight's show, I want to show you guys something I saw on Twitter today. Let me see if I could find it. So for those of you who are watching live or watching the playback, you'll see that I'm showing a tweet that was posted on Twitter today by someone named Nkunzi Ibomvi Neshoba Leo. I don't know what that means exactly, but you know, this tweet, I'm going to read it for those of you who are listening to the playback instead of watching it live or watching it on YouTube. The tweet says, I was going through my niece's school books and I was shocked to find this sad face, and he's referring to the attached picture. And he says, our children are still being taught the same garbage we were taught back then. And then there's a broken heart emoji. And the thing is, there's like a handwritten lesson here. And under the activity, here's what the child had to write. And it seems like this child is in the continent. The child writes, the Khoisan lived at the Cape, right? So it sounds like South Africa. They got a check mark from the teacher for that. The Dutch arrived, this is the next point, the Dutch arrived at the Cape. They got a check mark, meaning that that's correct. The third bullet point, the Dutch improved slaves. They got a check mark from the teacher for that. And, my response to that was, this is why we need, it's thus the immediate need for new African-centered curriculum. You see, it's not just us outside of the continent that needs an African-centered curriculum. Those in the continent need it as well. In fact, Only to say from the pro-Black perspective, commented on this and said something along the lines of, if the schools ain't changed, the lessons haven't changed either. And that right there sums it up. If you're doing the same thing over and over, that's insanity, right? And if you're doing the same thing, you're going to the same schools over and over, and there's been no change, expect this type of stuff. When you have an African-centered curriculum, there's no glorifying, there's no sanitizing of colonizers and savages. And so this is why maybe not you guys who are regular listeners of the show, but this is why we got to get our people around us to change our thinking and change our activities. There's a lot of work to be done, not just here, not just the Caribbean, but also on the continent. There's a lot of work to be done, but we got to change. We are the adults. We have to change our mentality. This is what our children are being taught in schools and being awarded grades, right? When you get this red check mark for this type of statement, right? You have now been indoctrinated that the Dutch improved you. You see what I'm saying? So we got to do better with how we educate our children, with the curriculum that they get. Don't expect other people to give them a good curriculum. You have to give it to them. All right? So that's the first point I wanted to make with you guys today. The paper itself, The Deadly Challenges of Raising African American Boys, Navigating the Controlling Image of the Thug, by DAWN Marie Dow from Syracuse University. Before I go further, let me just quickly post this link here. I'm going to post a link in the chat room. That's the link, that's the invite link to my Discord. It just dawned on me that if you wanted to, I've had some great listeners who've been posting comments and making the show a little bit more interactive, which has been cool and really good. If you have Discord, and you want to hop on, join my Discord. Go to the on air. Under the live show category, go to on air or the waiting room, either one. And if you have a comment or something you'd like to say or whatever during the show, you can hop on and you can do that. Peace to the pro-black perspective in the chat room. Peace. Also, hello to I Am Sudan. Thanks for joining me today. Good to see you guys again. I Am Sudan. I don't know if you're a guy or a girl, so let's clarify that, please. All right. So let's get to the reading. It's kind of a lengthy one. Let's just get to it. So the abstract of sorts, or the introduction, says, through 60 in-depth interviews with African American middle and upper middle class mothers, this article examines how the controlling image of the thug influences the concerns these mothers have for their sons and how they parent their sons in light of those concerns. Participants were principally concerned with preventing their sons from being perceived as criminals, protecting their sons' physical safety, and ensuring they did not enact the thug, a form of subordinate masculinity. Although this image is associated with strength and toughness, participants believed it made their sons vulnerable in various social contexts. They used 4 strategies to navigate the challenges they and their sons confronted related to the thug image. 2 of these strategies, experience and environment management, were directed at managing characteristics of their son's regular social interactions, and 2, image and emotion management, were directed at managing their son's appearance. By examining parenting practices, this research illuminates the strategies mothers use to prepare their sons to address gendered racism through managing the expression of their masculinity, racial identity, and class status. For those of you who are here live with me today, what are your thoughts on what are your early thoughts on having a strategy where you make sure your kids look a certain part and play and act a certain part, in public, to diminish, the others from viewing them as a threat or what have you? You know, kind of like that respectability type politics type stuff. What's your early thoughts on that type of thing? How's more people in the chat? Jakadero Asoe, Hotep to you, brother. I am Sudan as a guy, 28 years old. Greetings. I am Sudan. Welcome to the fold. All right. I'm going to skip over the author's note. So the keywords here are adolescent, children, emotions, mothering, race, gender, and class, men and masculinity. I like when they include keywords, right? So interviewed Karen, or Corinne. Oh, actually, you know what? Before I do that, let me just do something real quick. Okay. Interviewed Corinne, a married mother, in her apartment while she nursed her only child. Corinne let out a deep sigh before describing how she felt when she learned the baby's gender. I was thrilled the baby wasn't a boy. I think it's hard to be a black girl and a black woman in America, but I think it is dangerous and sometimes deadly to be a black boy and black man. Oscar Grant and beyond, there are lots of dangerous interactions with police in urban areas for black men. So I was very nervous because we thought she was a boy. I was relieved when she wasn't. It is terrible, but it is true. How many of you have had similar experience when your child was born? Post that in the chat room, let us know. Karen's relief upon learning her child was not a boy underscores how intersections of racial identity, class, and gender influence African American middle and upper middle class mothers' parenting concerns. They are aware that children will likely confront racism, often start addressing racism during their children's infant and toddler years, and attempt to protect their children from racially charged experiences. See, this is why I talked about it in the last episode. This is why I find it so mind-blowing to see guys like Van Jones talk about not knowing about racism until they're like 20. Responding to these potential experiences of racism, parents believe giving their children the skills to address racism is an essential parenting duty. Staples and Johnson, although the participants in this research were middle and upper middle class and thus had more resources than their lower income counterparts, they felt limited in their abilities to protect their sons from the harsh realities of being African American boys and men in America. Research demonstrates that race and gender influence how African Americans are treated by societal institutions, including schools and employment. African American children also experience gendered racism. African American boys face harsher discipline in school and are labeled aggressive and violent more often than whites or African American girls. Although African American families engage in biased preparation with their children, the content of that preparation and how gender and class influence it is often not researched. Anecdotal evidence depicts African American parents as compelled to provide gender and race-specific guidance to their sons about remaining safe in various social interactions, even within their own, often middle-class neighborhoods. This article examines how African American middle and upper middle class mothers raise young children, conceptualize the challenges their sons will face, and how they parent them in light of these challenges. I focus on mothers because they are often primarily responsible for socializing young children. Right? This is why it's so important to get the minds of our women right, even before they become mothers, right? And specifically our middle, because they typically have more resources So, and specifically on middle and upper middle class African American mothers, because they typically have more resources to address discrimination than do lower income mothers. Indeed, one might assume that these mothers' resources would enable them to protect their sons from certain challenges. African American mothers are more likely to engage in the racial socialization of younger children and to prepare children to address experiences of racism than our African American fathers. They are also more likely to be single and thus principally responsible for decisions related to their children's educational, social, and cultural resources and experiences. Although there has been substantial public discourse about African American mothers' ability to teach their sons to be men, right? There has been little systematic analysis of their involvement in these processes. Yeah, I could do a whole conversation on my feelings about, a mother can raise a male alone, that's for sure. Not too sure they could raise a man. Also, cultural stereotypes of uninvolved African American fathers overshadow research demonstrating their more active involvement. Although masculinity is associated with strength, participants' accounts of their parenting practices reveal their belief that the thug image made their sons vulnerable in many social interactions. Participants feared for their sons' physical safety and believed their sons would face harsher treatment and be criminalized by teachers, police officers, and the public because of their racial identity and gender. Their accounts revealed 4 strategies used to navigate these challenges, which I term experience, environment, emotion, and image management. So that brings us to a section called Raced, Classed, and Gendered Parenting Challenges, and a subsection called Gendered Racism and Controlling Images. Scholars have examined how race, class, and gender influence African Americans' experience in various settings. African American boys and girls experience different levels of social integration within suburban schools. Boys are viewed as cool and athletic by classmates and are provided more opportunities to participate in high-value institutional activities, while girls are viewed as aggressive and unfeminine and are provided with fewer similar opportunities. That's crazy to me that our girls, according to these savages, are looked at as unfeminine, as like from a little girl's age. It's crazy. Despite having somewhat positive experiences with peers, boys' encounters with teachers and administrators are fraught, as educators often perceive them as aggressive, violent, and potential criminals. Compared to whites and African American girls, African American boys are disciplined more severely in school, and their in-school discipline is more likely to lead to criminal charges. So this is what you send your kids out to, and I know you know most of you here have heard a lot of these things before, I'm sure. But this is just the reminder of what we send our kids into every day. I talked about a couple of months ago. I had a son in a charter school, and his teacher was one of his teachers. This was years ago. One of his teachers was really a lawyer, but she was doing that 50% off bullshit that they do to get half their debt, erased. And a little white chick too, and from the Midwest somewhere. And she looked at these kids who were already taller than her, right? This is how small she was. She looked at them as a problem. She was afraid of them, and you could tell. You could walk into the classroom and you could physically tell that this was going on. African American boys are also more likely to have encounters with law enforcement than are whites or African American girls, and these interactions are more likely to have negative outcomes. The news The news provides numerous examples of fatal shootings of unarmed African-American teenage boys, often by white police officers and private citizens. Initiatives like the White House-sponsored My Brother's Keeper bullshit are responding to an expansive body of research that demonstrates African-American boys face disproportionate challenges to their success from schools, their communities, law enforcement, the workplace, and beyond. So, last time I talked about, how, we have to understand that white folks are doing what they're supposed to be doing if they are in fact a nation, right? Which they are. Here in America, for example, they are a nation. And so you got to understand what racism is in that context, right? They're doing things for their nation. They're protecting their nation. They choose their people over other people in all aspects of life, be it in schools, in academia, in law, in law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we got to understand that this is what they're doing. Now, the thing I never could ever really reconcile is, when you start killing unarmed children, boys, right? You have just declared, I don't care what no one says, you have just declared straight up and down war. You understand? You have just declared straight up and down war, because let me tell you something. You and me and collectively our black ass, we can't go and kill their children like that without there being some payback. War. When Dylan Roof walked into a church of all places, I'm not a big Christian or religious person or whatever. In fact, I'm not. But when you do that, that's war. And to me, the point I'm trying to get at is, I could understand you being a nation and doing things for your people and, to maintain your nation and stuff like that. But the acts of violence that's perpetrated, like unprovoked, perpetrated, that really, to me, it goes a little bit beyond just making a nation or just maintaining a nation. That's the point I'm trying to get to. Okay. Collins in 2009 theorizes how controlling images function as racialized and gendered stereotypes that justify the oppression of certain groups and naturalize existing power relations while forcing oppressed populations to police their own behavior. Scholars studying controlling images examine how these inaccurate depictions of black sexuality, lawfulness, temperament, and financial well-being are used to justify policies that disempower women of color and impact African Americans' experience in their workplaces, school settings, and other social contexts. These images depict African American men as hypermasculine, right? Revering them as superhuman or reviling them as threats to be contained. When you go back, this podcast was started in the wake of the Mike Brown killing. And the thing that always stood out to me about the Mike Brown killing by that cop is that cop describes a person, a super Negro, if you will, right? A guy who just pushed himself into a cop car to try take a cop's gun off of him, unsuccessful, starts to run away, and then just, I guess the sun charged him up like super Negroes get charged up all the time by the sun. He turned around, he had a demonic look in his face. This is what this white savage of a cop said, right? And then he charged at him from some 15 feet away or something. What person do you know unless they have a mental, disorder. So what person do you know? I don't care how high you are. I don't care how drunk you are. You're gonna sober up when something like this is happening. What person is gonna charge a cop under those circumstances? But the reason why that white boy could tell that lie is because this is the image that they have of black men, or this is the image that they create and put out there. This is the propaganda they put out there to make us seem, hyper masculine and superhuman, super Negro. Scholars suggest that African American men enact the thug. Scholars suggest that African American men enact the thug, a version of subordinate masculinity associated with violence, criminality, and toughness, because they are not permitted to attain hegemonic masculinity. That's interesting. Indeed, African American men who enact alternative versions of manhood that are associated with being educated or middle class confront challenges to their masculinity and racial authenticity. Expanding on this scholarship, I examine how the thug image influences African American middle and upper middle class mothers, parenting concerns, and practices when raising sons. Building on Ford's view that black manhood refers to imagined constructions of self that allow for more fluid interactions in black and non-black public and private social spaces. I argue that this fluidity is not just permitted, but required to protect black male bodies and manage their vulnerability in different contexts. Black manhood and double consciousness, Du Bois in 1903, are complementary concepts because each requires individuals to see themselves through the broader society's eyes. These concepts also illuminate how individuals who are associated with privileged identities, such as man or American, confront obstacles that prevent them from benefiting from those identities as privileges. And for those of you in the chat room who are like, well, I think I am Sudan is actually in Utah, but if you're in another country outside of the U.S., I want you to comment if your parents or the parents that you are familiar with, do they carry out some of these strategies that we'll be, reading about in this paper? Is it the same? Because we recently saw the end SARS stuff, where SARS is a police force unit that's brutalizing its own people, right? African people brutalizing black African people. So is it the same in your neck of the woods? So this takes us to a section of the paper called Emotional Labor and Identity Work. Scholarship on emotional labor and identity work examines how African Americans navigate stereotypes. Hochschild, in 2003, argues that individuals who perform emotional labor induce or suppress the display of certain feelings to produce specific emotional states in others, thereby contributing to their subordinate position. Okay. Studying a predominantly white law firm, Pierce, in 1995, uncovers how men, but not women, garner rewards for expressing a range of negative emotions. Summers Effler, in 2002, examines how feeling rules become associated with particular positions in society, and the members of groups generally occupying those positions. Building on Hochschild's 2003 theories, scholars demonstrate that fearing they will affirm controlling images, African Americans believe there is a limited range of emotions they can display in the workplace without confronting negative stereotypes, and thus feel less entitled to express discontent or anger. There is truth to that. I mean, if you're a black man listening to this podcast and just listening to that section there, Have you ever been in a workplace and felt that you kind of weren't allowed, right? Because of the folks that you're working with and for and around, right? Meanwhile, and I've literally seen this in labs that I've worked in. Meanwhile, there's white boys and white girls slamming doors and cursing and, saying all kind of wild shit, and your black ass couldn't dare do something like that. Historically, interactions between whites and African Americans have been guided by unspoken rules of conduct and signal different status positions and maintained and reproduced a social structure that subordinated African Americans through acts of deference. These acts included African Americans using formal greetings to signal respect to whites, while whites used less formal greetings to signal their superiority. Violations of these rules resulted in frustration, anger, and violence from whites, and anxiety, fear, and submission amongst African Americans. Man, certain things I like to highlight for later. Rawlins's 1985 research reveals how African American women employed as domestics suppress their emotions and physical presence in interactions with white female employers. Indeed, adhering to specific feeling rules maintains and reproduces racial class and gender hierarchies, even as individuals circumvent them. In the chat room, Jacadero Asaway says, I used to have locks, and the entire 5-year lock journey, my dad, a continental African, told me often to cut my hair, mostly because he thought it wouldn't be respected here in the upper Midwest. Yeah, so that's, again, you're not allowed, right? I mean, I'm speaking from these savages' voice, right? And then they will make you feel it, right? And so that's one of the problems with like being in the rat race. In the rat race is fundamentally European, right? The traditional rat race, fundamentally European. You go to a job interview, you got to wear one of their suits, right? You got to wear their ties. You got to wear their soft pants. You got to wear their shiny shoes, right? You got to have your hair cut, in some facsimile of how they cut their hair, right? And then, so when you see like a black person make it in the rat race, if you study them, you study someone who's completely submerged in whiteness, right? Completely Eurocentric. You go to that person with a dashiki or something like that, they'll ask you if you're crazy, right? Because that's the game. The game, the whole game, the whole rat race, all that shit, that just is, it's meant to, especially if you're a smart person, you're a hardworking person, it's meant to disconnect you from your community. And even when you ascend in the rat race, I've seen this too, even when you ascend in the rat race too, again, what this paper is saying is somewhat true. While you'll be walking in there, giving everyone a pleasant hello and, good morning, this, that, hey, what's up? They'll hit you some shit like that. I remember years ago, I was working again in this lab, and this white guy, the supervisor of the lab, he walks up to me one morning. This is like, Busta Rhymes was hot at one point there, and he walks up to me and says, yo, where the dilly, yo? And I looked at him like, what? And this is my boss. I looked at him, are you crazy? What are you saying to me right now? Right? I don't speak like that, so don't come to me with that bullshit, but that's the game that these guys do play. Rawlinson, I think I read that. As African Americans traverse different economic and social strata that are governed by different rules, scholars identify how they manage the expression of their racial identity and class through code switching. right? You guys have heard about code switching before, right? Through code switching, shifting, identity work, and cultural flexibility. Carter's 2003-2006 and Pew's 2009 research demonstrates that African American children and families, respectively, often necessarily retain some fluency in low status cultural capital, even as they ascend economically. Lacey in 2007's research also suggests that some middle-class African Americans emphasize their racial identity, class identity, or racially infused class identities, depending on social context, to gain acceptance. Although these scholars examine how African American middle-class children and families negotiate race and class, gender is not central to their analysis. This article complicates their scholarship by analyzing how race, class, and gender affect how mothers encourage their sons to express their racial identity and masculinity. Schrock and Schwalbe argue learning how to signify a masculine self entails learning how to adjust to audiences and situations, and learning how one's other identities bear on the acceptability of a performance. Mothers play an important part in this gendered, classed, and racialized socialization process. You know, going back to that story that our brethren Jacadero said just now, that's also a part of the strength of having a African-centered curriculum. Remember, I've said this in the past, that an African-centered curriculum will give you a level of self-esteem. In fact, it's supposed to give you a high level of self-esteem. And so that when you have a high level of self-esteem, you know, if you want to, you know, because there's no laws against this stuff, but if you want to grow out your beard, you want to grow your locks, or what have you, you want to wear an African dashiki for men, or an African print, you know, dress for women or whatever. Your education would make you so immersed in being African, you wouldn't give a shit really about what these folks have to say. And you wouldn't really care about what they have to say or how they may want to treat your children and stuff, because your children are educated in a way that makes them strong and makes them be able to solve problems. And that's really what it comes down to. Once you're solving problems and you're solving it for your people, you're good. You know? So this article gets to the methods now. This article is based on data from a larger project that examined how African American middle and upper middle class mothers approach work, family, parenting, and childcare. Participants were recruited using modified snowball sampling techniques. Study announcements were sent via email to African American and predominantly white professional and women's organizations. Announcements were made at church services and in bulletins, and were posted at local businesses and on physical or internet bulletin boards of community colleges, local unions, and sororities. Announcements were also posted to listservers catering to parents, mothers, or African American mothers. Participants who were interviewed were asked to refer others. Through these methods, 60 participants were recruited to the study, of which 40 were raising sons only or sons and daughters. Aside from the opening quote describing a mother's relief upon learning she was not having a son, this analysis focused on participants raising sons. Interviews were conducted in person in a location of each participant's choosing, including her home or office, cafes or restaurants, and local parks. Interviews lasted from 1 hour to 2.5 hours and were conducted between 2009 and 2011. I asked participants about the families in which they were raised, becoming mothers, and their parenting concerns and practices. Before each interview, participants completed a demographic information sheet that included questions about their marital status, education, total family income, and family composition. Table 1 lists participants' pseudonyms and demographic information. All participants live in San Francisco Bay Area and were middle or upper middle class as determined by their education and total family income. Participants attended colleges for at least 2 years, and their total annual family incomes range from $50,000 to $300,000. Participants' total family incomes were as follows. 1, 27% were between $50,000 and $99,000. 2, 23% were between $100,000 and $149,000. 3, 23% were between $150,000 and $199,000. And 4, 27% were between $200,000 and $300,000. The upper end of this income range is high by national standards. However, in the San Francisco Bay Area between 2006 and 2010, the median owner-occupied home value was $637,000. Ownership is an important marker of middle-class status. All right, participants at the upper end of this income range were among the few who could easily attain that marker. Half of the participants were homeowners and half were renters. Participants' age spanned from 25 to 49. The majority of participants, say 63%, earn advanced degrees such as an MD, a JD, so we're talking doctors, lawyers, or academic doctors, or Masters of Arts holders, with 27% earning college degrees and 10% attending some college. 3/4 of the participants were married on a domestic partnership, and 1/4 were divorced. This is the data table, table 1 that they referenced, that shows you the pseudonyms, right? That shows you what kind of work they did, their occupation, their age, their level of education, right? And as you can see, most of them have a master's degree at least. You know, there's an associate's degree in there, but most of them have advanced degrees, you know, upper level advanced degrees. There's a mix of those who are single, married, divorced, etc. All right, so these are the data. So we're just going to scroll past it because they gave us a summary, right? But this is like the raw data. Okay, so where was I at the end there? Three-fourths of the participants were married on or in a domestic partnership, and 1/4 were divorced. Go back down. Never married or widowed. All participants were raising at least one child who was 10 years old or younger, as this research focused on mothers who are raising young children. Participants' employment status included working full-time or part-time, or not working outside of the home, i.e. stay-at-home mothers. Using grounded theory and the procedures and techniques described by Strauss and Corbin in 1998, I transcribed interviewers and coded them to identify and differentiate recurring concepts and categories. A key concept that emerged was the controlling image of the thug, a version of subordinate masculinity identified in masculinity and Black feminist scholarship. That's an interesting definition of thug, a version of subordinate masculinity identified in masculinity and Black feminist scholarship. when you guys define thug, does it resonate with this definition? What is your, put this in the comments or the chat room if you're here with me live. What is your definition of thug, right? I would say European, but you know what I mean. Some participants use the term thug or thuggish. Others use language that refer to a component of the thug, such as criminality, violence, and toughness. Outliers within the data were examined to determine how they challenged or could be reconciled with emergent themes. So the outliers are the people who don't fit within, within like the trend of the data, right? Or who don't fit in the heart of the data, right? Outliers within the data were examined to determine how they challenge or could be reconciled with emergent themes. My focus here on the account of mothers precluded a direct analysis of fathers' views, but fathers were involved in these strategies. This focus also precluded an analysis of how African boys and teenagers navigated these challenges themselves. As a middle-class African-American mother, I shared traits with my participants. These characteristics, so the author is a middle-class African-American mother, right? In case you were wondering. She shared traits with her participants. These characteristics in some ways positioned me as an insider with participants and facilitated building rapport and their willingness to share information about their lives. This status also required that I refrain from assuming I understood a participant's meaning. I balanced building rapport with guarding against making assumptions by probing for additional clarification when a participant suggested I understood something based on our shared background. So, I've talked about this before, but one of the things I really like with papers that use questionnaires or what have you as a vehicle for accumulating data, right, and then crunching the data to look for trends and stuff. One of the things I like about that is, especially when they describe it well in the methods, you can now go and do this experiment. You may want to replicate this experiment, and based on the outcomes that we'll get to, you might decide where you want to change a variable, right? You want to change a variable, and you want to see, you want to answer some question that's tangential to the question that they're dealing with here. And so by looking at this paper, that allows you to get an idea of how to design your experiment too. And again, this is something you guys could do this. You could do this via social media, because I think they mentioned that they use emails and stuff like that, and message boards. You can do this. And we need more of our people engaging in citizen science. By the way, I've talked about this in the past, so I won't get into too deep here. But there's a field of science that's emerged since about 2005, especially. I mean, it's always kind of been around. If you think of the fellow who they say discovered electricity, right, with a kite and string and all that old dumb shit. He in that story would have been doing citizen science, right? So we really need to we do really need to learn how to conduct experiments, follow a logical order of steps, control control variables so that control variables to make sure that everything is tight, and that the differences and so that there's no differences in the variables whenever we do an experiment or for one experiment to the next, right? So that's something that we should think about, That brings us to this next session called Protecting Sons from Baby Racism and Criminalization. Baby racism. There's such a thing as baby racism. Okay. If you guys can hear me still in the chat room, hit me a thumbs up, please, so I know that you guys are indeed there. And if you're there, I'd like you guys, if you can, I'm going to be like double question mark. You guys know who that is. I'd like you to answer my question about what do you define a thug to be? So this section, protecting sons from baby racism and criminalization. Although participants describe parenting concerns that transcended gender and related to fostering other aspects of their children's identity, this article examines that specific concerns about raising sons, their specific concerns about raising sons. Participants' concerns included ensuring the physical safety of their sons in interactions with police officers, educators, and the public, and preventing their sons from being criminalized by these same groups. This takes us to a section called Gender, Racial Identity, and Parenting. I'll also like to remind you guys at this time, if you haven't already, please give the video a thumbs up. Also, if you want to comment live on the air, and you can join the Discord, hop on the server, and you could enter into the to the on-air voice channel. Only I say says in chat room, we can hear you. Okay, thanks. Thug seems to be an urban bandit. Okay, that's your definition of a thug, an urban bandit. All right. So gender, racial identity, and parenting. Generally, middle-class children are thought to live in realms of society characterized by good schools, an abundance of educational resources, and protection from harsh treatment from police, teachers, and the public. However, numerous scholars have demonstrated that despite the expansion of the African American middle class, its members face economic, social, residential, and educational opportunities that are substantially different from those of middle-class whites. You guys should remember, I've talked about this in the past too, a long time ago in an episode, but that's one of like the crazy things about how these white folks set this game up, right? If you check out white society, they're the quote unquote deplorables, right? Even though they all are deplorable, but they're quote unquote deplorables. Are sent down by the tracks. They're on the other side of town, right? They're not moving around with Billy Bob and them kind of, the ruffian types, the types who will knock your block off and rob you. They're not around those guys like that. Those guys tend to be put into a little corner somewhere, right? I always reference the joke from Chris Rock, right, where he talks about being from a certain part of, living in a certain part of New Jersey where Jay-Z and them, Mary J. Blige, Jay-Z is his neighbors, right? Affluent black people. But when he looks at his neighbor, the guy who lives next door to him, is just some dude named Phil who's a dentist. Some white boy named Phil who's a dentist. Not the greatest dentist of all time, just a dentist, right? So that's what happens. That's how they have this game set up, where you can be in black society. You can, you could be middle class, maybe upper middle class, if there's such a thing, and you could still be, around ground zero, where all the drama goes down in black society. That's the cold game that they play, right? Meanwhile, if you get out of the quote-unquote hood, you go around their average, more or less affluent people. It's wild. Middle-class African Americans continue to face discrimination in lending, housing, and employment. African American middle-class children often attend schools that are poorly funded, lack adequate infrastructure, and are characterized by lower academic achievement than their white counterparts. These children are also more likely to grow up in neighborhoods with higher levels of crime and inferior community services as compared to their white counterparts. So this is kind of what I'm talking about, right? You could be middle to upper middle class and you could still be around the element, right? In every society, there's an element. You know, some people don't like to hear that kind of talk, but it's just a reality, right? Marcus Garvey and them guys, they understood it too. In every society, there's an element. And, you know, they're the folks, if you're about, you know, trying to be about something, you want to kind of distance yourself a little bit from that element. Most times when people say that about black society, you'll have some skinning and grinning Negro talking about, well, in the 60s, it was the street dudes and hustlers who supported MLK. Oh, all right. That was 1960, you know, 1962 or something like that. We're not there anymore. We're not talking about that right now. Right now, we have some folks around us, albeit black folks, albeit descendants of Africa, you know, but they're not about the things that they should be about, the things that we all should be about, right? And they have most of us mixed in with that kind of element. This is why we got to change the education in our people, so that regardless of who we're around, where they are at economically or what have you, we can still be on an accord. You know, we don't have our own people oppressing us in our neighborhoods and, you know, etc. Although participants recognize that their middle class status afforded them additional resources, they believe that their sons' access to middle class realms of safety were destabilized and diminished because of their racial identity and gender. Charlotte, a married mother of 4 sons, who lived in an elite and predominantly white neighborhood, held back tears as she described her fears about how others would respond to them. Quote, "I look at the president. I see how he is treated and it scares me." She's probably talking about Obama. "I want people to look at my sons and see them for the beautiful, intelligent, gifted, wonderful creatures that they are and nothing else. I do not want them to look at my sons and say, there goes that black guy," or hold on to their... She sounds like she's out here, you know, you is kind, you is beautiful. You know, I mean, listen. Again, we shouldn't care about our children being accepted, right? Or seeming acceptable to these other folks, right? These other folks are not our business. What we have to do is make sure that our kids are model black citizens for black society, or black nations, however you want to put it, right? That's what we really need to be concerned with. You is beautiful, you is intelligent. Similarly, Nia, a married mother of 2 sons who lived in an economically diverse, predominantly African-American neighborhood, described interactions with other families at local children's activities that she called baby racism. From the time our first son was a baby and we would go to different children's activities, from the time our first son was a baby and we would go to different children's activities, okay, that's a weird sentence, our son would go and hug a kid and a parent would grab their child and be like, oh, he's going to attack him. And it was just like, really? Are you serious? He was actually going to hug him. You see like little baby racism. That's not baby. Anyway, I have even written to local parents listservs to ask, am I imagining this? And the response was interesting. Almost all the black mothers wrote in, "You are not imagining this. This is real. You're going to have to spend the rest of your life fighting for your child." And all the white mothers said, "You're imagining it. It's not like that. You're misinterpreting it." And it was like, okay, so I'm not imagining this. You guys see the problem with that little blurb right there? Yeah. That blurb is problematic in terms of that black mother and her thinking. The black women told her, "Nah, you're not imagining this." Then here comes some white women finessing. And she was like, "Okay, so I'm not imagining this." I'm sorry, I said that wrong. But the idea is that the mentality is just messed up, right? Charlotte and Nia, like other participants, believe that when African American boys participated in activities that were engaged in by predominantly white and middle class families, their behavior faced greater scrutiny. Race and gender trumped class, poverty, and crime were associated with being an African American boy. Participants believed the process of criminalizing their son's behavior began at an early age and was not confined to educational settings, but was pervasive. Although participants had no way of knowing how others were thinking about their sons, numerous studies support their belief that African American boys' actions are interpreted differently in a range of settings. Participants also saw teachers and educators as potential threats to their sons' development. Caroline, a single mother of a son and daughter, described her son's experience of being harshly disciplined at school. A teacher was yelling at my son because some girls reported that he cheated in Foursquare. I had to let her know, don't ever pull my son out of class for a Foursquare game again. And don't ever yell at my child unless he has done something horrible. This sounds like a strong ruffian type sister here. I told the principal, she may not think she is racist, but what would make her yell at a little black boy over a stupid Foursquare game? He said, "Oh my God, am I just so glad that you have the amount of restraint that you did, because I would have been really upset." I said, "As the mother of a black son, I am always concerned about how he is treated by people." Like Carlin, others relayed stories of educators having disproportionately negative responses to their sons' behavior, describing them as aggressive or scary, when similar behavior in white boys was described as more benign. Carlin and others continuously monitored their sons' schools to ensure they received fair treatment. Ferguson's 2000 and Noguera's 2008 research supports their assessment, identifying a tendency among educators to criminalize the behavior of African American boys. Participants' middle class status did not protect their sons from those experiences. Mary, a married mother of a son and daughter, also believed her son faced distinct challenges related to his racial identity, class, and gender, and sought out an African American middle and upper middle class mothers group to get support from mothers who were negotiating similar challenges. Mary described a conversation that regularly occurred in her mother's group, revealing her worries about adequately preparing her son to navigate interactions with teachers and police officers. With our sons, quote, "With our sons, we talk about how can we prepare them or teach them about how to deal with a society, especially in a community like Oakland, where black men are held to a different standard than others are not necessarily a better one. When you are a black man and you get stopped by the policeman, you can't do the same things a white person would do because they might already have some preconceived notions, and that might get you into a heap more trouble. We talk about our sons who are a little younger and starting kindergarten. What do we have to do to make sure teachers don't have preconceived ideas that stop our sons from learning because they believe little brown boys are rambunctious or little brown boys are hitting more than Caucasian boys? So again, you see these narratives are intentional. It's a way of hiding the hate. It's a way of hiding, them trying to protect, because there is hate. It's a way of them trying to protect what they're doing in terms of keeping themselves empowered, etc. And again, if you're not doing anything with your children, right? If you're not doing anything extra to change their education, to change, to give them an education that, gives them, a higher self-esteem, that makes them give back and work towards a better African nation or better Black community of their own, you're failing those kids. And you might be in a situation where you have to send them out to these people's schools, right? For various reasons. I get it. But at home, you need to be, you really need to be giving them the strength that they'll need in this world, right? To even this playing field, right? It's worth emphasizing that although these participants were middle and before I continue, the reason why I said that at that point too is because, do you think this would be the case, that these would be the complaints, these would be the interactions of mothers and fathers with Black instructors in Black schools under an African-centered curriculum? Do you think this would be the exchanges, the verbal exchanges that you would have? To continue, it is worth emphasizing that although these participants were middle and upper middle class African American mothers with more resources than low income mothers, these resources did not protect their sons from gendered racism. Also, middle class mothers are depicted as viewing educators as resources, but these participants viewed educators as potential threats. They believed their sons' racial identity marked them as poor, uneducated, violent, and criminal, and they would have to actively and continuously challenge that marking and assert their middle-class status in mainstream white society, a version of the politics of respectability. Remember I mentioned that earlier. Some participants attended workshops aimed at helping them teach their sons to safely engage with teachers, police officers, and the public. Like the parents described by Leroux and McNamara in 1999, some use race-conscious strategies and others use colorblind strategies to address concerns about gendered racism. Let me say something about this. You always want to select race, not just race-conscious, not just race anything, but race-first strategies, right? Race-first consciousness, etc. Right? That colorblind bullshit is just more game, right? It helps no one. It definitely won't help your children. Although most participants believe their sons face challenges related to the thug, a few did not. These participants attributed their lack of concern to their sons' racially ambiguous appearance. Kira, a married mother of 2 sons, said, "The way they look, they're like me. They could be damn near anything depending on how they put their hair. I don't think they'll have the full repercussions of being a Black man like my brothers or my husband." Kira's comments echo research suggesting that skin color differences impact African Americans' experience in employment, school, and relationships. Participants also believe their sons face pressure to perform specific versions of African American masculinity that conform to existing race, class, and gendered hierarchies. Nora, a married mother of a son and daughter, said, "There is a lot of pressure for black boys to assume a more thuggish identity. There aren't enough different identity spaces for black boys in schools, and so I want my kids to have choices. And if that's a choice, I might cringe. But I would want it to be among a menu of choices. Elements of the thug, such as criminality, aggression, and low academic performance, recurred in participants' accounts as something they and their sons navigated." Scholars Ong, 2005, Wingfield, 2007, have identified how African American adults negotiate controlling images, but Nora's comments underscore that these negotiations begin at a young age. Given these pressures to perform specific versions of African American masculinity associated with poverty and criminality, participants try to protect their sons from early experiences of subtle and explicit racism because of the potential impact on their identity formation. Sharon, a married mother of a son and daughter, captured a sentiment shared by many participants when she stated, quote, "Each time a black boy has a racially charged interaction with a police officer, a teacher, or a shop owner, those experiences will gradually start to eat at his self-worth and damage his spirit. He might become so damaged that he starts to believe and enact the person he is expected to be, rather than who he truly is as a person." And, you know, again, that's nothing but a word, because that sums up a problem with the public school system. A problem with these Eurocentric-centered curriculum. By the time you go through that stuff, and I've spoken about it in the past, even on a college level, by the time you walk in an organic chemistry class and you see you're the only black person in that class, it's a psychological warfare at that point. There's so much to have to try to overcome when you're looking at all these different groups paired up together or grouped up together in these classes. You know, participants believe their sons were bombarded by negative messages about African American manhood from the broader white society and at times the African American community. Participants worried about the toll these messages might take on their sons' self-perception as they transition to manhood. They steered their sons away from enacting the thug, but also observed an absence of other viable expressions of racially authentic middle-class masculinity. That brings us to another section called Strategies to Navigate the Thug. Strategies to Navigate the Thug. Think about that title there, right? I'm going to pause here for a second to do a station ID, and I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And we're back. We're continuing this paper that we're reading tonight that deals with the thug, navigating the controlling images of the thug. And so far it's been a pretty decent paper. If you guys like the paper in the chat room, let me know. Hit me with a thumbs up or what have you. If you're listening at the playback in the comment section, drop a comment. hit me with a thumbs up or what have you as well, so I could know that you, how you felt in general concerning the paper. In the chat room, Renee, Peace Sister, says this sounds like a simulation training. Yeah, it sounds like a simulation training, and with good reason too, right? For it sounding that way, because again, you're dealing with, they say, middle and upper middle class people, people who have some resources, and like I read earlier in the paper, the kind of money a lot of them have, or money and resources a lot of them have. We always got to remember there's a certain thing about elites in our societies that kind of sell us out, right? And so these folks don't necessarily, up until this point, don't necessarily sound like they're pushing to in a revolutionary way to topple this order. It sounds like they're just trying to navigate, to assimilate into the system and be able to navigate it a little bit more pristinely. So strategies to navigate the thug. This might confirm what Renee is thinking. Legal scholar Krieger, 1995, argues that the law has a flawed understanding of racial prejudice, and that rather than being an active and explicit set of beliefs, racism operates by shaping our perceptions of behaviors. A loud white boy is viewed as animated and outgoing. A loud black boy is viewed as aggressive and disruptive. Similar to the interracial interactions in the South that Doyle in 1937 describes, participants believe that whites expected African-American boys to adjust their behavior depending on the racial identity of the person with whom they were interacting. Participants walked a tightrope between preparing their sons to overcome the gendered racism they might confront and ensuring they did not internalize these views or use them as excuses to fail. That's it right there. Christine, who was engaged to be married and the mother of a son, explained that in teaching her son what it means to be an African-American man, she wanted to ensure that he did not grow up with that black man chip on his shoulder. And this is why it's important that we create more Afrocentric men and women, people who are going on to be parents, right? But especially women, considering that, like Malcolm X would say in the past, when you teach a man, you teach one man, but when you teach a woman, you teach a nation, right? So I'm not coming down on women or anything like that, but understanding that, as the paper surmised early on, that a lot of times it's the women who are our children's first teacher. To continue, feeling we are weak. Whites have done something to us, and we can't do something because of white people. Christine wanted her son to understand how some viewed him, but she tried to foster a version of double consciousness that emphasized his agency and discouraged him from feeling bitter towards whites. And right there is the assimilation stuff. Disempowered or constrained by others' views. Next, I outlined the strategies participants use to navigate the thug image and teach their sons how to modulate their expression of masculinity, race, and class. Participants often preferred one strategy, but they may have used other strategies or a combination of strategies during different periods of their sons' lives. That brings us to this section, experience and environment management. How would you guys, if you don't have children, or if you intend to have children, particularly if the outcome is that you have sons, but it's still true for black children as well, black daughters as well. How do you intend to handle this perception of whites of like the thug Negro. Right? You can put that in the live chat or in the comment section if you're listening on the playback. Participants use 2 explicitly race, class, and gender-conscious strategies to manage their sons' regular social interactions: experience and environment management. Experience management focused on seeking out opportunities for sons to engage in activities to gain fluency in different experiences, both empowering and challenging, of being African American boys and men. Environment management focus on monitoring their sons' regular social environment, such as their school or neighborhood, with the aim of excluding sources of discrimination. These environments were often primarily middle class, but diverse in terms of racial identity, religion, and sexual orientation. Participants often use environment management when children were preschool age to avoid early experiences of discrimination. Despite having additional resources, participants navigated a landscape of institutionalized childcare, which they believe included racially insensitive providers. Participants using experience management tried to help their sons acquire what they viewed as essential life skills. The ability to seamlessly shift from communities that differed by race, class, and gender is definitely assimilationist training. Right? Definitely that. Experience management involves shuttling sons to activities such as Little League baseball, basketball, or music lessons in a variety of neighborhoods comprising African Americans from different economic backgrounds. Participants also expose sons to African American culture and history and African American men, including fathers, uncles, cousins, coaches, or friends, whom they believe express healthy versions of masculinity. Carlin said, I worry about my son, quote, I worry about my son because he is not growing up in the kind of hood mentality that me and his father had, but he will have to interact with those people. Those people. Carlin's son was not completely ensconced within the safety of a middle-class community. She believed that as her son traveled through his day to school, riding on buses, walking down the street, going in and out of stores, and interacting with police officers and the public, he would be perceived in a range of different and primarily negative ways. Carlin believes her son would have to adjust the expression of his masculinity, racial identity, and class to successfully interact with people from that hood mentality. Listen, people, family, I understand code switching, right? I get the concept. I'm from a predominantly black country, and there was a code switch that occurred there. How I spoke in school with my friends and maybe even sometimes with my teacher was different than when I went to church and I had to speak in front of the audience, right? So I get it, and I get there's times where you got to switch up the code. But this shit here, masculinity is masculinity. This adjusting the expression of it is just pure nonsense. Racial identity is racial identity. Any adjusting is nonsense. But if you're out here trying to mix in with these folks, this is the type of nonsense you're going to be doing. And this is what you're doing to your children. And again, if you're not pushing your children through strong African-centered learning structures, this is the kind of stuff you're going to be doing with your children. Or they'll be failures, complete failures to society. What do you want? You want your children to be high esteemed members of the black community, the global black community. You want them to be people that you can rely on, that you can call on to help uplift the community, to help solve whatever problems the community faces. You want them to be strong. You want them to have high self-esteem. You want them to be patriotic so that they do the work for their people unapologetically. Because this type of shit that they're doing here will have you apologizing for your manhood. It'll have you apologizing to people for being black. A version of subordinate masculinity and people from other racial and class backgrounds. I'm sorry how I read that. Carolyn believes her son would have to adjust the expression of his masculinity, racial identity, and class to successfully interact with people, just say white people, right, from that hood mentality, right? Because that's ultimately what they're saying. A version of subordinate masculinity and people from other racial and class backgrounds. She believed that lacking regular experiences and settings, like the one she grew up in, put her son at a disadvantage in these situations. Carolyn sought out experiences to help her son learn to navigate a world that she believed viewed him primarily as an African-American boy and potential troublemaker rather than a good middle-class kid. She ensured that her son had regular contact with his father and other African-American men. She also regularly discussed examples of clashes between African-American men and the police with her son. Okay, that's fine. Maya, a married mother of 4, also used experience management. She described how she and her husband exposed her son to alternative and, in her view, more positive ideals of masculinity. Quote, with our son, we definitely have a heightened level of concern, especially around public schools, about what it means to be a black male in this society. My husband does stuff with him that is very much male socializing stuff, but it is worrisome to think about sending him into the world where he is such a potential target. I know how to make a kid that does well in school and can navigate academic environments. My husband knows how to help young people, black young people, understand their position. But the world sees them and how they might see themselves in a different and much more positive way. Through these experiences, out of necessity, participants aim to help their sons develop a double consciousness, a sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. That's that Du Bois bullshit, right? Maya and her husband did this. Let me just highlight that real quick as a reminder. Double consciousness. Maya and her husband did this by teaching their son how others might perceive them while rejecting prevailing images of African American masculinity and crafting alternatives. The thing about the double consciousness thing, right, is these white folks don't have no double consciousness when it comes to you unless they're a culture vulture performing a grift. You know, recently Vlad TV came under, some scrutiny, which is kind of dumb anyway, because, let's face it, these black entertainers, rappers, what have you, go on there and tell all the deets of all the shit that they did in the past, the recent past sometimes. Vlad asks them some follow-up questions. They answer those too. And then they put it on YouTube for 1 million people to see it. And then you're surprised when the feds talk about, well, we saw you talking about some shit in an interview on the internet. Of course, Vlad is the feds, not necessarily actually being a fed, but of course he's a part of the, what do they call it again when Biggie and Pac and them were doing their foolishness back in the day? The rap task force or something like that. Of course he plays, and he knows what he's doing, by the way. Don't be fooled by it. Vlad knows exactly what he's doing. Not only is he making money off of it, but he's getting you guys sent up the road off of the bullshit too. Maya and her husband did this by teaching her son how others might perceive him while rejecting prevailing images of African American masculinity and crafting alternatives. Environment management involved managing sons' daily social interactions by excluding specific kinds of exposures. Rachel, a married mother of a son and daughter, said, quote, "My son thinks he is street smart, but he is used to being in an environment in which he is known. No one thinks of my son as a black boy. They think of him as my son. But when he goes out into the real world, people will make assumptions about him." Rachel lived in a predominantly white neighborhood with few other African American families. She believed her neighbors did not view her family as, quote, the African American family, but simply as a family that this protected her son from challenges associated with being an African American male in the broader society where he might be assumed to be part of the urban underclass. Charlotte, who was mentioned earlier, described her efforts to find a neighborhood with the right kind of community. Quote, "When we lived in a different, predominantly white suburb, none of the mothers spoke to me. Maybe they would have, but I was really taken aback by how shunned I felt. We were the only black family in the school, and no one spoke to us. Here, another predominantly white area, over the summer, people knew my name and I didn't know their name. There was a feeling of welcome and friendliness from the group. You know, I just worry so much for them. I want them to be accepted and not judged, and not looked at like a black kid." See, this is some goofy shit right here. What's her name? Charlotte is goofy. I want people to look at them as, that is a good, quote, that is a good young man or a good boy, end of quote. Maybe if they know my sons and me and my husband, it won't be, quote, "Oh, they are the black kids. There goes the black kids," basically. It will be, "There is us." Yeah, so Renee hit it on the head. In fact, Renee has posted in the chat room again. Renee said, "I have no idea. I became a mother this year, and I distinctly remember the relief I felt when I found out I was having a girl." Okay, so Renee kind of resonates with that first mother who they quoted at the start of the paper. These mothers set their sons up to fail. I agree. They all sound like they try to distance themselves from the blackness. And, you know, that's really at the heart of it. They distance themselves from blackness, but they do this cursory, you know, amount of, you know, black activities, right? To make them still feel like they're, you know, we're still black. We still eat some ham bones, you know, every once in a while, you know, and so they do these little kind of symbolic almost type activities to make them feel like they're still grounded in blackness, but you're not. You're actively trying to have it. I mean, you're really and actively trying to have it where your children are not viewed as black. If you're the only black family in a predominantly white suburb, can you imagine what those children are going through in school? What they're learning and how it makes them feel inside? It's crazy. Charlotte wanted her sons to have access to better resources in schools, and that translated to living in primarily white neighborhoods. And you see, that's the thing there too, right? This is how you get the sellout and the sellout elites right here. Because we are the people are not investing in, are not building and investing in our own school system, right? Because we're not investing in our communities. You know, you've heard the slogans of buying up the block and all this kind of stuff. Because we're not doing any of this stuff, there's an escapism that goes on with some of our people, if not many of our people. Right? This is escapism. And the fix is so simple. Take over, run, protect your own schools, your own education, right? Own the area that you live in, right? Like there's this place in Brooklyn. I like to take my kids out there sometimes too, to be honest, called Dumbo. And they have this pier out there that these white folks, every year, they improve upon that pier out there every year. Conversely, in another part of Brooklyn where there's a pier in Canarsie, where there's mostly black folks living out there now, right? It used to be a predominantly white neighborhood back in the day, and then they had white flight and a lot of black folks took it over. Right, the pier is just raggedy. Nothing's going on. I look at it and I'm like, wow, if we really could get together here, right? Being that most of the homeowners are you know, out here are black, you know, there's a possibility to make something nice for our people, right? Again, we don't own the pier and all that shit. I get it, right? And this is why ultimately down the road, you got to get out of here because you really don't have the ownership here, right? But anyway, this is what you see Charlotte and them doing here. This is that escapism. A lot of black folks look over at the white side of society and think that the grass is greener over there. And it's because we're not doing the fundamental work, Charlotte included, right? Instead of stay in her neighborhood and try to create something just as fly or even more fly for her children, for all of our children, etc., they just run over to the white side. Nevertheless, revealing the diversity in white settings, she looked for white neighborhoods where she believed her sons would not face discrimination, which is just madness. White neighborhoods where they won't face... is that the blind as a bat neighborhood? Is this white neighborhood the blind as a bat neighborhood? Charlotte hoped to transform her sons from anonymous African-American boys assumed to be up to no good to the kid next door. Well, isn't that still anonymous? Being African-American was accompanied by assumptions about lower class status and criminality that participants sought to overcome. Charlotte's experience underscores how intersections of race, gender, and class are used to value individuals and the challenges her sons confronted to be seen as both African-American and good middle-class kids. Participants living in economically diverse, predominantly African-American communities with higher crime rates face particular challenges when using environment management. Jamila, okay, we know as a black woman, Jamila, a single mother of a son, explained, "I live in Richmond because it is more affordable, but I don't see a lot of parents like me. I keep a tight leash on my son because of where we live. I don't want him to get involved with the wrong element." Jamila and participants living in similar environments often did not let their sons play with neighborhood children, which is a big problem, right? Her experiences highlight class divisions within African-American communities and the intensive peer group monitoring parents engaged in when their residential choices were limited. These children's regular environment did not include their immediate neighborhood, but was confined to controlled spaces, including their school, church, or other settings that were diverse free of racial discrimination. Is that possible? And often primarily middle class. Experience and environment management both focus, hold on one second. Experience and environment management both focus on social interactions, but with different aims. Experience management aims to inform sons through regular controlled activities about the challenges they may face as African American boys and men, and teach them how to modify the expression of their masculinity, class, and racial identity. Environment management aims to reduce or eliminate the challenges of being an African American male, so they are not in the defining features of their sons' lives. These mothers try to find or create bias-free environments that would not limit their sons' expression of their masculinity, but worried about their sons' treatment outside of these safe. Hey, look, man, in America, right, there's no safe haven. There's no safe, and if there were to be a safe haven, it will be in your community that you run, control, and protect. This brings us to the section image and emotion management. Participants also use image and emotion management to reduce the vulnerability they believe their sons experience related to the thug image, and to prevent them from being associated with poor urban African Americans. These strategies were also explicitly race, gender, and class conscious, and focus on their sons' emotional expression and physical appearance. Sons were encouraged to restrain their expressions of anger, frustration, or excitement, lest others view them as aggressive or violent. You see, so this is where you kind of feminize these black boys who should be growing up as strong, to become strong black men. Participants also counsel their sons to strictly monitor their dress and appearance so they would be viewed not as criminals, but as middle-class kids. What was the name of the fella the other day? I think it was in Texas, who was one of these Blue Lives Matter Negroes, and a cop, I think he was breaking up a fight between some white women or something, and a cop came and shot him and killed him while he was extending his hand to shake the cop's hand. Respectability politics be damned. Carlin engaged in something she called prepping for life with her son. She said, quote, "I talk to my son constantly. We do scenarios and we talk about stuff. I'll pose a situation, like say, if you are ever kidnapped, what do you do? If the police ever pull you over, how do you need to react?" So we do scenarios for all of that. It's just prepping for life. It would not be unreasonable for a parent to instruct their child to view police officers as sources of help. What is striking about Carlin's examples is that she viewed child predators and police officers as equally dangerous to her son. She used emotion management with the hope that prepping her son for these scenarios would give him some agency in his response to the moment. So another question for you guys listening, either again in the chat or in the playback. Do you do any of these prepping strategies for your young children? Or if you have older children now, did you do these, anything similar with your children? Like, did you ask them how they would handle it if they were to be kidnapped? For example. Right? Did you do them? What kind of things did you prep them about? What kind of things did you talk about? I'll be curious to know. In the chat room, Sister Renee says they all sound like they try to distance themselves from their blackness. Absolutely. These women all sound like Democrats who think covert racism is better. Yeah, it's the, like the ostrich sticking his head in the ground, believing that if his head is stuck in the ground, others won't see him standing there with his head stuck in the ground. It's that kind of thing. And this is damaging. This is highly damaging to our people. This is why, I would really like to know, I'd have to look and see if there's a follow-up, which I doubt there is. But I'd like to know what the fathers are doing or thinking about during this time. I know some of these people are single mothers and divorcees and stuff like that, but what are these fathers really thinking about this? Some participants look for places where their sons could safely express normal boy behaviors while gaining control over those behaviors. Heather, a divorced mother of a son and 2 daughters, described her plan to help her son control his emotions at school. Quote, I'm hoping to get my son into enough relaxation-type yoga classes so he is a little bit calmer when he goes to school. I want to make sure he lets it all out in the play yard and activities after school. Well, just buy him a dress then. At this point, just buy him a dress, some high heels, and a pretty little purse, and let him sashay his little self through life. Through activities like yoga, karate, and meditation, these participants hope their sons would learn to restrain their emotions, and this ability would translate to their interactions with teachers, police officers, peers, and the public. Participants emphasize that there were appropriate times to express feelings and advise their sons to refrain from responding to discrimination in the moment. Lord have mercy. Instead, taking their time to determine the best approach. So a cracker being a cracker, I can't call him a cracker? Fuck that. This often meant reframing race-related grievances in non-racial terms, so they would be better received by white teachers and administrators. Although masculinity is associated with strength, participants believed their sons were vulnerable and did not have the freedom to exhibit certain feelings or behaviors. Participants also encouraged their sons to engage in image management to avoid being viewed as thug. Rebecca, a widow with 1 son, who also raised her nephew in his teenage years, recounted discussions during which she counseled her nephew about how people interpreted his clothing. Quote, things like him wearing his hoodie and the assumption that he is up to no good. I tried to explain that to him because he didn't understand. He said, I'm just wearing my hoodie. But baby, I understand what you're doing and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you walk through the poor, primarily African-American and high crime neighborhood near my school, we see something different. Just having to protect him and trying to shelter him from unnecessary stress and trauma. The sagging pants and all the things that teenage boys do that don't necessarily mean they are doing anything wrong. Is it fair? No. Is it reality? Yes. Rebecca's comments illustrate a parenting paradox. Even as Rebecca challenged the double standards that she believed were used to evaluate her nephews and sons' behavior and appearance, as a practical matter, she felt compelled to educate them about these different standards. At times, she counseled them to adhere to those standards for their own safety. Given the recurring news stories of unarmed African-American boys shot by police officers and private citizens, Rebecca's approach seems reasonable. Participants believe their sons might be labeled thugs because of their attire, thus leaving them vulnerable to attack from others. Participants could not prevent these interactions from happening, but wanted their sons to survive. You know, that reminds me of the talk. Like, I remember, you know, being a kid in the 80s and early 90s, the talk of, like, you know, what a woman wore was the cause of her being, you know, sexually accosted, which is just nonsense. When I was in my home country and we heard that, like, on a TV news clip or something, we were like, what? That didn't resonate with us at all. What? You know, and it sounds like this is the male version of it now. What you wear will get you killed. In the chat room, Jacadero says, hold on, I'm behind. Okay, in the chat room, Jacadero says, not a parent, but from listening to an episode of the PBP by Oni, the Pro-Black Perspective by Oni, I asked my nephews what they would do if a teacher asked the class to produce a slave play, and they were asked to represent the slave. Jacadero says, my nephews thought real deep, and both said they would take it like a man and play the slave. Jacadero then posed the surprise black person emoji. Renee Moore, having read that, said, wow. Jacadero says, that just hurt my soul. Jacadero goes on to say, I then gave them a speech about how them being Africans, they deserve better, and they should never in their lives believe they need to degrade themselves. Renee says, I'll have to ask my nephew that question. Jacadero says, I told them that no matter the cost, whether being kicked out of class or school, being shunned by classmates, etc., they deserve better, and tell the teacher in class that they will not accept that role. Jacadero responds to Renee and says, imagine I almost was expecting them to say that, I almost was expecting them to say that, right? Oni talked about how schools in the West indoctrinate our youth to be weak Africans. And that's the thing, like, thanks for those comments in the chat room. Really eye-opening stuff, and it kind of helps to tell this story of what the paper is talking about here. And I'll say Oni is correct. What Jacadero said is correct, that, you know, these schools, just by the nature of how the schools, as they said in the West, are constructed in terms of their curricula, right? You can only feel less than in those schools. I've talked about it personally in terms of, you know, I came to America to go to college, so I didn't go through the school systems here, but, you know, I went through college, and even I can tell you how, and I came from a pretty savvy, you know, pro-black family. You know, I'm from a nation that was mostly black, and even I walked into some of those chemistry classes, like I've said, you know, before, and felt a little ways about it. Felt isolated, and you know, looked at these other groups pairing up and grouping up, and knowing that they were sharing, you know, intellectual resources, etc., academic resources. And they were getting ahead in the class where I, by myself, had to work my black ass off, right? I mean, listen, if this kind of stuff that I'm reading here tonight, and other readings I've done in the recent past, if this doesn't shake you up and motivate you to shake up others who look like us, to really start to not start to consider, but to start to know and start to work towards something different, to raise the esteem of our children who will go on to be hopefully our leaders, Because if you don't raise their esteem, then they won't go on to be our leaders. We'll be left with these type of children, the Charlotte's children, the Carolyn's children, all these kind of different people, right? We'll be left with their children because they have a black face and they talk about being black. We'll be left with those people to be our quote unquote leaders, AKA Obama. This is what and the future is everything. The future is now, as a matter of fact. And if this stuff doesn't resonate to our people, this is why an episode like this, and let me say, I'm happy for the few people who jump on live and the few people who listen. I wish the numbers were better, but guess what? I feel good that you guys have tuned in. But what I'd like for you guys to do is to start sharing it with your own commentary, right? To others around you. Email a link to a friend or two. Post it to social media. Things get lost in the sauce on social media, but email it to your friends personally. Here's this link. Check this out. We got to do better. That's all you got to say. Because truly, we got to change this thing. We are sending our children to, look at this reading, right? We're making, we're some of us are actively damn near handing the dress, the skirt, the blouse, the heels to our boys. And at times doing even worse with our girls. I talked about that in previous episodes. How we need our women to be involved. If we want to talk about nation building, we got to have our men and our women, our boys and our girls doing the learning so that they could do the work in the future. We're at the conclusion of this paper. Once again, I hope you guys like the paper. Make sure to like, to share, to subscribe, to click the bell to know when I'm on, right? Before I go read the conclusion, I want to remind you guys that there are other shows on KWAZ Radio podcast network, right? So take a listen to this.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And we're back, and we're at the home stretch now. Again, I hope you guys make sure to check out those other shows, as well as the Queen's Council podcast on KWAZ Radio. Here we are at the conclusion of the paper. I don't see anyone looking to hop on air live. That's fine. I'm not complaining, just saying. In the conclusion, this research was bookended by 2 shooting deaths of unarmed African-American males. The first, Oscar Grant, was shot in the back by Officer Johannes Mercele while lying face down on a Bay Area rapid transit platform. The second, Trayvon Martin, was pursued, shot, and killed by George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch coordinator, while walking home in his father's quote-unquote safe, middle-class, gated community. Despite being a child from that community, it was not safe for Mr. Martin. He was not viewed as a good middle-class kid, but was instead interpreted as a threat. Since these incidents, African American parents are increasingly sharing the concerns they have for their son's safety. And I like the fact that this author is about something, because, well, now she's showing that she's about something, and that she says it outright. Like, he was, Trayvon was in a gated community, middle class community, maybe middle to upper middle class community, and he wasn't safe there. Which also adds to the idea that, America cannot be your final resting place. Again, the population within the nation, right? Because even in this quote unquote safe, gated middle class community, this white boy wannabe cop, right? He's a wannabe white boy and a wannabe cop. He killed this young boy. Pursued him like a criminal and got into a fight, got his ass handed to him, and killed him. Associated Press writer Jesse Washington in 2012 wrote a heart-wrenching but matter-of-fact editorial describing how he advises his son to behave in affluent neighborhoods and in interactions with police and others. These instructions may have changed his son's spirit, but increase his chance of remaining alive. Incidents like these reminded participants that their sons have different experiences with the public than do white boys and men, and hopefully these folks got the memo here. The thing with Trayvon Martin is, like, he was in this gated, like I said, middle class, probably upper middle class, affluent community. But fuckboy Zimmerman didn't even consider that Trayvon lived in that community. So all this goofy stuff that you're doing, that some of these women describe that they're doing, still wouldn't matter, because these white folks won't even consider that you're from that community. They'll just see a black fella and kill you. Even though I have my complaints about, the way the community is set up, the black community is set up in America, right? Where you take some black folks who are more or less, the affluent group, right? More intellectualism than not, etc. The thing is, though, it's better off us to be around our own people. What we got to do is work on changing the way the community does business, so to speak, right? And how it treats its customers, us, so to speak. Initiatives like My Brother's Keeper focus on heightening African American male youth's agency in their lives, often paying less attention to the societal constraints they face. Some might suggest that recent videos of unarmed African-American boys and men being shot by officers are shedding light on those constraints and are compelling the U.S. government to take a closer look at law enforcement's interaction with African-American boys and men. These incidents draw attention to contradictions between American ideals and practices, underscoring the fact that solving these challenges is not just a matter of changing behavior or increasing resources. That's an interesting statement. Because oftentimes when you hear people talk about like what's going on in Chicago and stuff like that, they talk about, well, there's no resources around, and resources is what leads to the violence, right? These concerns about safety and vulnerability transcend class and are produced by societal forces. Although the practices of fathers were not directly examined, it is clear from participants' statements that they help to execute these strategies, and that's what I was curious about. So the author addresses that. Nonetheless, Given that African American fathers' parenting practices at times differ from those of mothers, future research might directly examine their concerns and strategies. Researchers might also examine how different intersections of race, class, and gender produce different forms of vulnerability and protection. Existing research suggests that having a male body and access to masculinity confers privileges and protections that serve as a symbolic asset to social interactions. And that's the thing, right? Within the last few years, there was this big push, and they pushed it heavy about black society. You know, black men are the white men of black society and all that bullshit, right? But the thing is, though, the thing that drives masculinity, and sometimes maybe it has its faults depending who you're talking to, but the motivations and the driving factors of masculinity are the same motivations and driving factors that provide protection, that make males become providers, protectors, builders, and that's what you need in society. All young boys, young girls need that male, and this is where men have to step up. Right? Men have to step up. You have a very important role to play. And you lead by your example, not by your words. You lead by your works. However, my research demonstrated that depending on its racialization, the male body can be a symbolic liability. Here we go. The thug image derives its power and strength from intimidation and is used to justify attacks on African American boys and men's bodies and minds. Participants' additional labor to protect their sons and its race, class, and gendered nature is largely invisible to the people it is meant to make more comfortable. And that's nothing but a word right there. You're doing all this stuff. These folks don't care. That's why it's goofy. You're doing all this dumb shit, and these people still don't care. They'll gun you down if they feel to gun you down. Despite having additional resources, participants and their sons were not immune to a social system that required them to police their behaviors, emotions, and appearance to signal to others that they were respectable and safe middle-class African-American males. Ironically, by feeling compelled to engage in strategies that encourage their sons to conform to stricter standards and engage in acts of deference, participants contributed to reproducing a social structure that subordinates African Americans. Their accounts show a continued need for African Americans to have a double consciousness through which they understand how society views them. Their actions also suggest a tension between individual strategies of survival and strategies that challenge and transform existing gendered, classed, and race alternatives. That's the paper. What did you guys think of this paper? I get an idea from the chat room what a lot of you would think of this paper. But what do you think this paper highlights best that we need to improve, within our own society? Right? One of the things that, I always think about is, how do you deal with, providing solutions, right? And if you do any research on it, people will say that, there's not a lot that could be done about the gangs and the thugging, the thug life type stuff. But the thing that we also have to understand, if we're talking about gangs, right, and thugs and all that kind of stuff, right? you got to start talking about, directly start speaking to, why do kids join these gangs and why do they want to appear as thugs and stuff? And a lot of times it has to do with simple, their friend is in a gang. Others would talk about, protection and certain low energy, enjoyment and all that kind of stuff, right? But at the heart of it, right? And I know I sound like a broken record. I said this last time as well. I sound like a broken record. But a lot of the problems with the thug identity, and even going as far as like, running around in gangs and all that stuff, is really a problem at school. And so the thing that we need to do is strengthen. Okay, here's some things I think we need to do, and you tell me if you agree with me or you disagree. Right? To prevent the thug perception, to prevent the actualized thug life, being in gangs and all that stuff, what we got to do is we got to strengthen up our community. We got to strengthen up our identity, right? We got to make sure families are more whole. We got to make sure the schools are better. We need to have, not just elders who are not just olders who are masquerading as elders, but we really need to have like real elders, who could help and who could help with community supervision. We got to have more Afrocentric teachers. I talked about that when we discussed the profile of an Afrocentric teacher. We need more Black women who are conscious, right? We need to stop leaving them alone, to be single mothers and all that kind of stuff. And we got to teach interpersonal skills better. I talked about it in a rant some time ago, and I'm going to bring those rants back. I've just been a little bit busy lately, doing research and presenting it here. But we gotta, if you remember, I talked about the Rayshard Brooks killing. And again, I'm not dealing in respectability politics so much as I'm dealing in the idea that I understand that there's a war going on, and you have to carry yourself as if there's a war going on. If you get in an encounter, especially in an encounter where, like in Rayshard Brooks's case, you're drunk, you're sleeping on yourself in a parking lot or a drive-through or both or what have you, and cops come along and say, "Look, we gotta take you down." Listen. Wrestling with two white cops, the outcome ain't gonna be good. Drunk or sober, the outcome ain't gonna be good. And so we gotta start talking to our youth, because he was young, right? 20-something. We gotta talk to our youth about how to navigate in war. They teach that to soldiers in the military. Why do you so why would you think you don't need to know this? You have to know how to navigate yourself behind enemy lines in war. In fact, I have a book that talks about this. So anyway, this was the chapter. I didn't see where anyone wanted to jump on, and that's fine. But this was the paper. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I seen the chat room. Renee says this paper further highlights how confused Black people are about racism and how it works, and that's exactly right. The way what racism is, we don't understand it. We think you could play the decoy and get by. Doesn't work like that. Your money won't save you either. You having money is not a bad thing. Let me say that right now. But like we saw with the Trayvon Martin case, I'm not saying his father was rich, but he was in a decent area, right? He was in a pretty, you know, decently or well-to-do area, and they still gunned him down and killed him, right? How much money you have in the bank won't save your children if they encounter these people out in these streets. But the knowledge that they receive, the education that they get, can allow them to better navigate the landscape. The resources that you are building can help to get you out of this place and to a place where you're more so protected. I asked a question earlier, but I don't think there's anyone in the chat room who is in the continent right now, right? If they've seen these kind of tactics and strategies from parents where the country is mostly black and the, you know, law enforcement is mostly black, like where I'm from, these kind of things, these kind of strategies and conversations don't really come up. People want you to look and carry yourself respectable, but not for these reasons. Not for a reason that it somehow shields you or protects you from the bullshit. Right? In the chat room, Renee asks, what book? Renee, I have to look up the title. I have it amongst my PDF books, which I intend to upload to the Discord as well, as a part of the Bitter Medicine Podcast library on Discord. I don't remember the name of it right now. Well, once I remember it or find it, I'll forward it to you, okay? So if there's no more questions, without further ado, I'll call that a night. Thank you guys for tuning in. Remember to like, share, subscribe, click the bell, all that good stuff. Make sure to share to the people who are right now closer to being more open to the knowledge that's being, you know, given out here. But don't be shy to share it to people who aren't there quite yet. This might help, you know, send them over the threshold. Until next time, which should be on Saturday evening. You guys take care. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.